They called me difficult to manage at 6:02 a.m. I put the phone down, poured coffee, and treated it like the problem it was. Theirs, not mine. If you like stories where competence punches above its weight, hit subscribe and stay for the part where the grown-ups make the adults who hired their own kid look foolish. The call was a sprint of corporate theater. Preston, breathless, with the sort of confidence you get when you inherit a title instead of earning it, read me the line everyone in HR keeps on speed dial. "We've decided to go in a different direction. You're too difficult to manage." He said it like he was reading a script he didn't write but desperately wanted to believe. Outside, dawn was easing open the curtains of my condo. Buster, a nervous, suspiciously judgmental golden who thinks my phone is a chew toy, circled my knees while I listened. The apartment smelled like cold espresso and the lemon detergent that still lived in the sink from last night's attempt at adulting. I noticed the light, the way it hit the hardwood. Little details settle in my chest like currency. They remind me that whatever they take, they can't take the hours I've lived. I hung up at 6:04, not because the call was over, because it was beginning. There's an odd, almost mathematical window that opens when a company fires someone in a modern cloud-managed workplace. Systems pulse, provisioning, deprovisioning, flags flip. It's clinical, it's automated. Most employers have it tuned to the millisecond to avoid risk. Most people think those milliseconds only matter for logins. They don't. They matter for relationships. At 6:45, I made the kind of coffee that requires apology. Too strong, a black wall I needed to climb inside. I sat at my kitchen island and watched email headers populate as if the world were assembling itself into a conspiracy against me. My access would begin to unravel at 7:30, some systems sooner, some later. There was a grace period, an ugly corporate phrase that sounded like mercy when really it was a machine's latency. Call it the ghost in the machine, a tiny time where you're removed on paper but still visible enough to read the room. People assume the only valuable things in a corporate job are policy documents, spreadsheets, and the corner office. That's the accounting version of the story. The real currency was never the slide deck or the CRM record. It was the human ledger I had maintained for a decade. My Rolodex was a network of breaks and levers, of favors recorded in the less formal ledger of lunches, late nights, and the occasional babysitting swap with a stressed portfolio manager. That relationship capital is invisible to auditors and terrifying to people who measure worth in headcount. I took a breath and cataloged. Timeline: 6:02 firing call, 6:45 coffee, 7:30 automated deprecision starts, 7:59 last functional access to certain collaboration threads, 8:59 Marcus Thorne's number in my contacts. 10 a.m. my LinkedIn went live. 12:30 a reply from someone who mattered. Those times are not arbitrary. They are the bones of strategy. They tell you what you can and cannot do before the world remakes you into yesterday's metadata. I logged into my laptop at 7:10. The machine warmed like a living animal. Keys clacked, clack, clack, clack. I don't tell you that to be cinematic. I tell you because habit is grounding. If you keep moving in a crisis, your mind has less room to panic. Let me be clear about something important. I did not delete files. I did not copy secret decks and ship them to a burner account. That kind of melodrama looks good in TV scripts and bad in court. I believe in precision, not crime. If you want to punish someone with permanence, you don't vandalize their house, you expose the truth of what they built. What I did was use the grace period to unmute possibilities and mute a few logistics. I opened the CRM, our shared customer relationship management system, and read the room like a surgeon reading a chart. For 10 years, I had been the thread between Optima and several institutional relationships. Names, patterns, subtleties. Who prefers email? Who takes a call on Tuesdays? Who hates long-form attachments? Who answers after 9 p.m.? These are not secrets, they are habits. Habits are leverage. Between 7:30 and 7:55, while the deprovisioning scripts were queuing like distant thunder, I made a few high-leverage, non-destructive moves. I canceled, softly, subtly, my presence from a strategy workshop that had 30 invited stakeholders across 3 time zones. I did not forward files, I did not change permissions, I simply removed myself and the internal organizer from the attendee list in the way one might quietly take back a table reservation. It's invisible bureaucratic arithmetic. Nobody loses data, nobody gets hacked, but the conversation shifts. The organizer's calendar went quiet. Their ping volume dropped. The small human expectation that Dana will run this dissolved. I also slid a calendar note to a few key client relationship managers. Not spam, not an email blast. Private, precise. Rescheduling internal alignment to ensure client continuity. No accusation, no drama. Professionalism as a rhetorical weapon. The aim was to create a slight logistical ripple that, when combined with other moves, would tilt attention away from code and onto competence. Who actually keeps the clients calm when someone goes missing? The ethical hinge of that morning made me pause. Chloe, junior analyst, quick smile, nervous thumbs, texted me at 7:40. "Are you okay? I'm hearing things. They say you're gone." She was collateral in the way junior staff always are when leadership coughs up an heir. My chest tightened. There's a twinge of guilt when you unsettle the people who trusted you for mentorship. I answered her straight. "Stay calm. Document what you can. I'll be in touch." It was protection and possessive instinct at once. At 8:55, I dialed Marcus Thorne. Marcus was not a friend by default. He was a strategic counterparty. He and I had crossed paths enough times that we knew how each other thought. He wasn't ideological, he was pragmatic, and that is the only quality that matters when money is moving. Apex Capital had their own problems, but they also had the appetite to take advantage of other people's mismanagement, legally, publicly, and with cold efficiency. He picked up on the second ring. "Dana, this is either really bad timing or exactly the kind you're good at. I don't do sob stories, I do port calls. I just lost my job," I said. "I'm available starting now, and if you want to move a relationship that matters, you should talk to me before you talk to their new point of contact." Marcus was quiet. "Are you serious?" "Yes, and if you want people to believe you mean business, you need that signal to be made quietly and fast. No theatrics, no leaks. You know I won't burn a bridge." This, more than anything, is how professional coups are staged, not by burning the building down, but by quietly showing that the plumbing still works when you change the landlord. Negotiations with a competitor are always an exercise in trust and leverage. I asked for 2 things: a role where I could immediately own the client interface, and a public stance that signaled market confidence. He offered a promotion and a short-term guarantee for continuity. He insisted on speed. We agreed verbally by 9:05. He put a formal offer in my inbox at 9:16 and asked for a signature by lunch. He was efficient in the way that sounds like competence and smells like intent. Meanwhile, back in the ruined office carousel, Preston was telling anyone who would listen that he'd done the right thing and that my attitude had been a problem. Richard Vance, his father, and the CEO, called twice and left messages thick with corporate paternalism. I listened to them like a distant weather forecast. They were blustering, warming each other up for storms they had no authority to predict. At 10 o'clock, I did the most dangerous thing you can do when you've been fired and still have reputation to manage. I posted. The LinkedIn post was not a meltdown. It was a small, measured paragraph that said what everyone who mattered already knew. I had been let go from Optima, I was grateful for the years of work and the people I learned from, and I was open to roles where I could continue doing the work I loved. No rancor, no accusation. The timbre was intentional, the public equivalent of a poker face, with the cards all gone to the dealer. The effect was not immediate bluster, it was a thawing avalanche. People spoke, privately and publicly, with the weird loyalty that stacks up when you've been helped through a crisis. Messages arrived. I'm sorry. Call me. We need you on a short project. Stay close. The post was a signal. Signals are a cheap resource in a world where most people shout and few people mean what they say. And then Arthur Sterling messaged. Arthur Sterling is a whale investor. You don't know whales by their name because they don't court attention on social platforms. They make allocations and move them without press photos. I'd cultivated Arthur indirectly over dinners where someone else did the heavy pitching, and I listened, intercalating myself into the connective tissue of the relationships he trusted. That's the thing with whale investors. They're allergic to incompetence that masquerades as leadership. At 12:30, his assistant sent a terse note. Mr. Sterling would like to talk. Available at 1:15? That line sat in my inbox like a temperature reading. You know how you check a fever because the number tells you whether a disease is systemic? That text told me opportunity was systemic. Legal noise began to creep in around 11. Gerald, Optima's general counsel, left a voicemail. The message was performatively legal: cease and desist, claims about confidential information, vagueness dressed as threat. There is a taxonomy of corporate legal intimidation: letters that are posturing, letters that are warnings, letters that are actual legal engines. Gerald's voice had the practiced cadence of someone who defends boardrooms, not reputations. I forwarded the voicemail to my lawyer and to Marcus's legal contact. I didn't panic. I simply acknowledged the fact of legal noise as part of the atmosphere. Threats are often louder than the facts. They're meant to corral movement, not prove a point. Still, you acknowledge them so the people who need to know aren't surprised when you move. There was one more contact that morning that made me pause: a message from Sarah Miller in compliance. Sarah Miller was the kind of person who lives in spreadsheets and sighs at loopholes. She sent a single line: if you want a copy of the historical compliance sign-offs from 2019 to 2023, I can pull them. Call me. Sarah Miller did not offer help lightly. Compliance often sits in the middle of truth and narrative, and in a firm where young nepotism had been rewarded, compliance sometimes quietly kept the ledger honest. Her offer suggested two things: that someone inside Optima saw the firing as reckless, and that some internal documents might not support the version of competence the leadership wanted to sell. I did not call her right away. I put the offer in my pocket like a match. I had to choose how to light it without setting the house on fire. By 12:45, the inbox had become a human knot. Chloe sent another message. I didn't know where to put the Q3 scenarios. Should I upload to shared or leave local? That small administrative question is the kind of thing that becomes a crisis when people panic. I told her to leave local and document the location. No drama. No anniversary of catastrophe. It was stupid sad how much my instinct was to protect the junior staff even as my world shifted. Arthur's assistant confirmed the 1:15 meeting. Marcus texted from his car, "Everything okay? Want me to sit in with you?" He didn't need to. He was testing my appetite for theater. I declined. This wasn't about witnesses. It was about credibility. At 1:15, I took a call that shifted the day's geometry. Arthur spoke without preamble. "I've been watching Optima. The leadership change surprised me. I'm concerned about continuity with the accounts you managed. Tell me, candidly, what I should be worried about." I answered with the kind of honesty that is calibrated for investors: clear, candid, constrained. I told him the truth about who does the work and who collects the bylines. I did not gossip. I named processes that had been failing under Preston's watch, not because he was already installed, but because a whale investor needs to know the fragility of what he is underwriting. He listened. Then he asked the question that changes not only conversations, but allocations. If I were to reallocate capital, where would it go and why? You will understand the gravity of that question only if you've sat in rooms where 8- and 9-figure decisions flick into being based on someone's confidence. I answered him with the same currency I'd used for a decade: competence, continuity, team readiness. I laid out how a modest signal could stabilize an account.
a named person, a public commitment, and a short-term continuity plan. That is not a step-by-step for sabotage. It's a description of what investors buy, certainty during chaos. He said nothing for a beat that seemed like a miscount of seconds, and then, "Meet me for lunch, 12 tomorrow. Bring whatever you need to convince me." I have learned in this work that being invited to lunch with someone with money is different from being invited by someone with power. Lunch with an investor is an argument in public. It's a decision wrapped as polite small talk. It's dangerous and it's necessary. On the way to Marcus's office to finalize the offer, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a terse email from Optima's HR. "Your non-compete is active pending your signature. Please be advised." It was a classic, a blizzard of legal phrasing intended to freeze movement. Non-competes are often ceremonial, highly variable, and crucially, a pain in the neck in legal hot water. Their presence isn't a showstopper, it's a question of counsel, timing, and public optics. Marcus and I signed the offer at 10:10 p.m. in a stadium of formality. He handed me a security badge and a corporate laptop with a company image wallpaper and a sticky note on the corner that said, "Welcome, we don't do theatrics." I smiled because that was exactly the point. I posted a short update to the Slack ecosystem that morning, not incendiary, not a manifesto, simply transitioning to Apex effective immediately.
I'll be reachable at my new email. It's the sort of dry, business-like announcement that threatens more than a conspiracy email. It signals that continuity exists outside the firm that thinks it owned you. And then the noise rose. Gerald's first legal missive was formal and thin with facts and heavy with teeth. "We reserve all rights," it said in the sort of legalese that pretends to be decisive and is often only posture. I forwarded. Marcus's legal team replied firmly, "We will participate in good faith discussions, but we will not be bullied." Sarah, Apex's general counsel, sent a welcome note directly to me at 3, saying she'd review anything pleadingly legal and that they would handle Optima's posturing professionally. Meanwhile, my LinkedIn post had shifted from a polite note to a signal with traction. Comment threads lit up. Peers praised, clients sent private assurances. Some journalists began asking quiet questions. One of the investors I'd briefly courted years ago wrote, "If anyone can stabilize that book, it's Dana." That public affirmation is not vanity, it's a pressurized room filling with oxygen. At 3:30, Preston IM'd a handful of people with a statement that read like a press release written by someone who had just learned what a press release should look like. The wording tried to neutralize a problem, but the phrasing betrayed inexperience. Too defensive, too clumsy. The board received an internal email from a nervous director asking for clarity. Small fissures are how cliffs begin. I ended the workday at Marcus's new office, the skyline visible as if the city were a diorama arranged for advantage. Buster slept against my feet under the desk, the sound of his breathing a reminder that life continues outside market capitalization. Don't mistake me, there was guilt that night. I watched an update from Chloe as she shared a screenshot that showed internal Slack threads in disarray. I had helped create the conditions that scrambled people's schedules, and for a few caused real stress. That hollow feeling, knowing your chess move cost someone else a night of peace, is part of what keeps ambition humane. I texted her, "Document, breathe, call me if you need anything. Don't pick up calls from anyone with a lawyer logo." It was not a platitude, it was triage. By 9 p.m., the narrative around my departure had bifurcated. On one side, Optima's official line, a necessary change. On the other, a river of small testimonies, each one a tiny dam being removed. I slept like someone who had done the right thing for herself, and maybe the wrong thing for the fragile heart of a company whose leadership preferred dynasty to discipline. At 7 a.m., Preston sent me a message that began with a faux cordiality and ended with a legal-sounding ultimatum.
You must cease contact with Optima clients and return all proprietary materials immediately. It's the kind of message that makes you sigh because it confuses pride with property. I took the message as an offer to let them misread the nature of my leverage. I didn't reply. Instead, I prepared for lunch with Arthur. The part of the story that always surprises people is this: you don't need to be a saboteur to rearrange power. You need two things: an accurate map of where obligations actually sit, not where titles claim they do, and the nerve to make a few people uncomfortable enough to act. At 12:25, Arthur's assistant called. The voice had an inflection that meant someone with money had already decided to move. Mr. Sterling wants to confirm he's prepared to reallocate up to $80 million contingent on continuity. He'll discuss details in person. The number landed like a meteor. A figure like that is atmospheric. It changes how oxygen behaves inside a firm. Inside Optima that afternoon, someone on the board called an emergency meeting. I read the public snippets like a detective: which messages were redacted, which statements were defensive. Preston, who'd thought firing me would be a short, clean cut, had now cut deeper into a problem he could not stitch closed. Gerald's follow-up legal message was less posture and more legal engine. We will pursue remedies for breach of contract and misappropriation. It had the ring of action, but lawyers use those letters the same way generals use cannons, to send a message, not always to fire. Messages to Arthur's office had the texture of decision-making: a quiet line of questions, a request to outline the client continuity plan. I supplied it. I kept it simple: named a team, named transition contacts, clear assurances. He liked simplicity more than spectacle. Simplicity is like oxygen on days when emotion spikes. That night, Optima sent an internal memo that was equal parts damage control and confusion. Richard Vance's name appeared in the subject line of an employee email that tried to reassure staff. It read like an attempt to keep a candle alight in a hurricane. And then, as the city lights washed the apartment in an indifferent glow, my phone vibrated. Arthur's assistant. Mr. Sterling will be in town tomorrow at noon. He's ready to move when he hears the plan. I looked at Buster, who cocked his head at me as if to ask whether I'd brought treats or trouble. I thought about Chloe's sleeping text, about Sarah Miller's hesitant offer of documents, about Gerald's legal drum roll. My chest made that small, conflicted sound people hear when they do something they know is right, and also know will hurt other people. The next morning was where the next move would be decided. I had offers arranged, legal counsel ready, a whale investor on the edge of being decisive, and a company that had misread its true assets. All of those things were like instruments tuning up before a performance. The audience had gathered. The conductor had a score. What nobody yet realized, and what Preston and Richard Vance were slow to see, was that relationships are not company property. They are people's choices. You can't appoint loyalty by fiat. At 8:55, I closed my laptop, fed Buster, and slipped on a coat. The city was a hard, indifferent thing in the rain. I walked to the car thinking of how many times competence is mistaken for replaceability. It isn't. When Arthur's office called at 11:50 to confirm lunch logistics, his assistant said one more line that tasted like an ultimatum and a promise rolled into one. Mr. Sterling wants to understand the risk to his capital if Optima continues under current leadership. That sentence, risk to capital, is the sentence boardrooms fear because it moves money faster than any memo. If money moves, power follows. If power shifts, reputations are reallocated. I sat at a curb and watched a bus with an ad for a luxury watch buzz by. Time, after all, is the currency we all pretend we can manufacture. You cannot make more of it, but you can schedule it. I checked my phone again. Marcus texted, "Stay tight. We'll amplify any move you make, publicly, quietly, however you need." He had the kind of confidence money breeds. I breathed slowly and reminded myself of two things. I had not cheated, and I had not lied. I had chosen to let relationships be the instrument of their own correction. If those relationships chose to move, I was merely the conduit. At 11:59, I stood outside the restaurant where Arthur had chosen to meet. The napkins inside were starched. The staff moved with the lazy precision of people used to money deciding their tip. When the host took my name, I felt the weight of the room decide what I might be worth. I also felt, oddly, the weight of a decade of choosing to be useful. The door opened and Arthur arrived with the soft, unflashy confidence of someone who owns more than he needs. He greeted me without preamble and sat down. His hands were precise. They measured the conversation's temperature before words were spoken. "You've made people uncomfortable," he said without accusation. "So what are you asking me to do?" I told him exactly and succinctly what the continuity would look like and what the immediate signal should be. I did not overpromise. I did not emote. Investors move when you make their plausible story easier to believe. He leaned back, folded his hands, and asked me about optics, how a move would read not just to clients, but to other investors. That's the moment where the math of relationships becomes public markets logic. Perception creates liquidity. Outside, Preston's phone buzzed, someone told me later, with a flurry of worried notes. He sent a message to Richard that sounded like a child summoning a parent when a tower of blocks fell down. Richard's reply, the board would later note, was unsteady. He had inherited more than a company. He'd inherited a responsibility he had not prepared for.
At 12:55, Arthur said something I'll never forget. "You don't have to be on the job title to be on the ledger." That's the language investors use when they describe someone whose presence preserves value. Quote, "If you want me to move capital, I need a named person, a signal, and a quick path to reassurance." You can imagine what happened next. I told him what pleased the professional palate: a named role at Apex, a public signal that preserved clients' confidence, and a coordinated outreach to the largest stakeholders. He nodded. The deadliest force in finance is not greed, it's the human need to avoid being wrong publicly. That is a lever you can pull without wearing a halo. When I left the lunch, the world felt a shade different. The number, 80 million, was not yet in motion, but it had left the realm of possibility and slid into the plane of decision. That is a dangerous place for a company that mistook the feel of power for its structure. On the cab ride back, messages poured in. Sarah Miller, in compliance, wrote half in relief and half in fear. I pulled the files. There are sign-offs that contradict the narrative Optima's pushing. She attached nothing but a promise. That signaled two things: internal dissent and documentary support for the idea that what Optima claimed publicly might not survive a detailed audit. I sat at my new desk at Apex by 3, badge flashing me into a room that smelled faintly of new coffee and corporate optimism. Marcus clapped me on the shoulder in a way that didn't feel performative. He was ready to play hard at court politics with better tools and fewer bones to break. Then the phone buzzed with an internal message from an Optima board member: "We need to understand the cash flow implications." Panic crystallizes into language very quickly. Cash flow implications. The phrase is a fast track to decisions. Gerald's legal team became louder, but in the kind of way lawyers do when they want to be heard rather than to act. Threats require a response, and responses create a paper trail that can be diplomatically managed. At 5:55 that evening, a reporter pinged me with a dry question: "Can you confirm you are with Apex now?" I answered only with what I had posted earlier. Professionalism is also a kind of firewall. It keeps rumor from metastasizing. When the markets quietly checked the ticker that evening, nothing obvious had happened. No crash, no spectacle, but a whisper in a market is a pressure that eventually finds a weak seam. That seam for Optima would be the mismatch between competence and appearance.
That night, I closed my laptop and looked at my hands. They were the hands of someone who had spent years assembling trust. The lines in them were ledger entries. I fed Buster, who did not care about leverage or investor appetite. He only cared about biscuits. There was a small satisfaction that crept in under the guilt. Preston had called the firing an exercise in decisive leadership. What it had actually done was reveal how much leadership mattered more than title. I was tired in a way that felt like the end of a chapter. The next morning at 9, an email arrived that made my chest drop and jump at the same time. Arthur's assistant wrote simply, "Mr. Sterling is ready to reallocate $80 million to Apex, contingent on a single public reassurance from Optima's board that continuity exists. He requests a board-level email with named contacts. He needs it within 48 hours." 48 hours! That is the thin margin in which boards panic, legal teams posture, and reputations get reallocated. It's also the margin in which decisions of consequence are made. I put down my coffee, looked at Buster, and walked toward the office that suddenly felt like a theater of decisions. My phone buzzed with a single unread message from Preston that said, "We're handling things." It read like someone telling you to be calm as the floor shifts under your feet. And in the quiet between breaths, I understood something complex and terrible. They had fired me thinking they could erase what I represented. They had mistaken the ledger of relationships for a liability they could write off. They had not counted on the people who trusted me choosing to act instead of listen to a press release. That was the point where the game turned from simple retaliation into a public test of value. Arthur's $80 million was not a trophy, it was a lever. To trigger it would require a small, coordinated set of public signals and quiet assurances. Nothing illegal, nothing theatrical, only accuracy and speed. It was the sort of thing only people who understood the value of relationships could orchestrate. At 10 a.m., just as a meeting with Marcus ended, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a short email from Sarah Miller. "I'm sending what I can. I'm worried, but I trust you to be careful." Attached were file names and timestamps, enough to make a board meeting awkward, not enough to be catastrophic, enough to show a contradiction between public statements and internal sign-offs. I took a breath. The next moves would be public, precise, and irreversible in their consequences. I texted Chloe, "Document everything. If anyone pressures you, forward it to Sarah Miller." It was a small command, logistical, humane, and intended to protect. By noon, the narrative had gathered a momentum that felt almost mechanical. A few private messages to key stakeholders, a strong public statement from Apex once Arthur confirmed, and a slow-burning reaction inside Optima. People began to choose sides. That is how market gravity operates. Capital follows coherence. At 12:30, my inbox pinged with a subject line I had been rehearsing for weeks in my head. Arthur Sterling, moving forward? The message was not a decision yet, but it had the tilt of one. I read it twice and felt the room tilt. I didn't reply immediately. There was a particular kind of joy in letting the possibility be tasted before it was swallowed. A few hours later, when the reply came, it would force every hand at Optima to reveal whether they were really in control or only comfortable sitting in their father's chair. I closed my laptop and walked to the window. Below, the city kept its steady, indifferent churn. Inside, however, the gears were shifting. My morning had begun with a phrase intended to belittle me, difficult to manage. By noon, the phrase had become a pretext for people to see what she actually did, make relationships work. There is a moral cost to what I was doing. I could feel it in the tightness behind my ribs when I thought of Chloe sleeping with her phone on her pillow. I could feel it in the way Buster looked at me like I owed him an explanation I didn't have words for. But there is also the cost of letting incompetence be rewarded with impunity. That I could not accept. At 3 p.m., an email arrived with the phrase I had been waiting for. Arthur Sterling has scheduled a board call with Optima for 10 tomorrow. He wishes to discuss governance. It was a small thing with a big heartbeat. Governance is the bureaucratic word for accountability, and accountability can topple dynasties. I set my phone down and watched the light tilt across the desk. The next morning would not be the end, it would be the beginning of a public test. The tools in my hand were not clandestine, they were reputation, timing, and the willingness of other people to act in their own interest rather than the illusion of their employer's stability. I made one last note before the day ended: be honest, be precise, and avoid melodrama. The court of public opinion prefers truth over theater, and money prefers stability to spectacle. If I was going to dismantle a fragile throne, I would do it with the same careful hands that had built the relationships in the first place. At 9 p.m., Preston posted another statement. It read like someone trying to mend a sail with white glue. The board called an emergency session. Gerald drafted another round of legal warnings. Sarah Miller sent one more message. I've left copies with a third party in case things get difficult. That was the line I slept on. It was not a threat, it was a contingency. It's the sort of quiet action that says, some people prefer to let the truth be seen if others make a spectacle. Some people put a copy where it can't be reflexively buried. I closed my eyes and thought of the morning at 6:02, a small, brutal sentence issued through a speakerphone. I had spent the day answering not with equal violence, but with measures that respected the truth and punished falsehood with consequence rather than cruelty. The rest of it, the board call, the market reaction, the speeches trimmed for PR, the wardrobe changes for camera time, that was a coming act. I slept with one certainty. You can't buy the trust of a client with a press release. You either earn it back with substance, or you lose it to someone who already has it. When the alarm went off at 5:30 the next morning, my phone already buzzed with a headline draft. The quiet before the storm had a clarity to it. Outside, the city was indifferent. Inside, people were deciding what they were willing to profess publicly and where they would quietly withdraw. I tied my shoes, clipped Buster's leash, and felt, for the first time in a long while, the steady weight of being someone whose absence mattered. I walked into the day with a suitcase of small, sharp things: a printed summary of continuity plans, a laptop with boot-up dignity, and a dog who thought any meal could be improved with moral support. At 7, I fed Buster, checked my messages, and read the line from Arthur's assistant one more time. Mr. Sterling has scheduled a board call for 10. It felt less like a calendar item and more like a countdown. Preparation is an oddly intimate kind of violence. You tidy the facts into order so that when the room gets loud, your voice is the one that cuts through. At 8:10, I opened the file Sarah Miller had dropped into my inbox at midnight. Compliance sign-offs, dates, timestamps. She hadn't sent everything, she'd been careful, but what she'd sent was surgical. There were approval stamps that didn't align with the public narrative. There were signatures in places that made the board's version of events look like an optimistic paraphrase. I read them twice, then forwarded them to Marcus's counsel with a single line, for context. Marcus's lawyer replied with quick efficiency and a promise: "We will be on the call. We will keep this professional." That was the kind of message that is both a comfort and a threat, the legal equivalent of sending two strong players onto a pitch. At 8:59, I checked in with Chloe. She'd been up all night, answering panicked messages from clients and internal teams. "I'm okay," she texted, then added, "They're asking for Q3 scenarios." I told her to leave everything in place and document everything she touched. The instruction was small, practical, and intended to protect her from the sudden downstream of what would follow. By 9:30, I was at a small conference room, laptop open, voice calm. Marcus was dialing in from his car. Arthur's line was politely restrained. The board's counsel was on the other end, the kind of voice that sounds like it measures phrases before it lets them go. The call convened at 10 sharp. Board calls have a different smell than ordinary meetings. There's the faint perfume of people trying to appear reasonable near crisis, the nervous tapping of pens, and the sound of someone clearing their throat for effect. Arthur began without a preamble. We need to understand governance. We need named contacts and clarity on sign-offs. He spoke like a man who had already decided a question in his head and was now testing how others would answer. Richard Vance started with a practiced defensiveness. He read prepared statements about leadership transitions, continuity measures, and the importance of strategic vision. His words were comfortable because they'd been written by people paid to make discomfort sound like strategy. Preston attempted to speak twice. Both times the room cut him off, gently but pointedly. He had the look of someone learning to run with scissors. When Arthur requested specifics about client continuity, I spoke. I kept my voice measured. I did not grandstand. I named people, I named processes, and I described, with the kind of dry precision that male investors often mistake for dullness, who exactly would manage which accounts and why the named people were credible choices. I kept the tone clinical because the room rewarded evidence over rhetoric. At 10:25, Arthur asked one of the questions every board member knows sends a pulse through a company like an IV. Is there any proof that the public statements about our operational discipline match internal sign-offs? Sarah Miller's name floated like a relief in the room. She'd been on mute, a presence in the conference thread. Her counsel said, "We're seeing some inconsistencies. We will circulate redacted supporting documentation after this call." That phrasing, redacted and circumspect, let the board save face while creating the possibility of scrutiny. The effect was immediate. Where there had been the slow comfort of plausible deniability, a new current of anxiety moved through the lines. Directors asked for time. One of them, a long-tenured member who'd sat quietly at the edge of things for years, sounded suddenly older. She said, "We need a governance review, and we need to involve outside counsel." At 10:50, before the call closed, Arthur asked the question that turns conversation into transactions. If we cannot get credible public assurance of continuity, and if these inconsistencies cannot be reconciled quickly, are you prepared for the possibility of reallocation? He did not have to say the number aloud. We all knew it. Preston's attempt at a confident answer was all bluster and no content. He promised internal reviews, a press release, and corrective actions, phrases designed to buy time. Richard's voice, for the first time, contained a thread of defensiveness indistinguishable from fear. The board closed the call agreeing to a private working group and a public statement to staff, but the arteries of decision had been opened. When money smells risk, it moves. The rest of my day snapped into focused motion. At 11:30, Marcus and I coordinated the public signal, a brief fact-based note from Apex confirming a conversation about continuity and Dana's availability to support bridging efforts. It was careful, purposeful, and designed to look like the work of a market functioning as it should. Investors asking sensible questions, service providers offering continuity. At noon, I had a short reconnaissance call with Arthur. He was blunt. If Optima gives us a named contact and a credible plan by tomorrow, we stand down, he said. If they offer theater, we move. He did not want a spectacle, he wanted enforceable clarity. That's how whales operate, quietly and decisively. The market's machinery doesn't always move on the first suggestion. It tests, it waits for evidence. But inside Optima, the machinery was brittle. Reports of internal disarray leak faster than board minutes. At 1:15, I watched, mildly amused and also unsurprisingly tired, as Preston issued a public statement that attempted to reassure clients while accusing unnamed parties of disruption. The statement read like someone trying to sew new cloth with blunt scissors. It dug the hole deeper. At 3, the company held its scheduled Q3 investor call. They had to. Public companies have rituals that are part legal obligation and part theater. When the theater goes wrong, reality leaks through. Richard Vance took the stage, courteous, composed, the exact image of someone who had never had to answer for talent decisions in public. Preston was slated to present the client stability slide. You can tell the moment a company realizes its narrative will be tested. It shows as an extra practiced polish on the CEO's voice. Richard opened with high-level figures, the usual forward-looking statements delivered with practiced optimism. Then came the Q&A. Investors are not cruel, they are boringly practical. They ask the same types of questions: client churn, fee schedule, concentration risk. But when you have a whale in the room who has already decided doubtfully, the tenor changes. Arthur asked about named contacts and continuity. He asked for specifics. He asked whether the sign-offs Richard described matched the internal documents that Sarah Miller had alluded to. Preston took the microphone. He tried to project the confidence of someone with a script and not enough lived experience. The questions were pointed. He stumbled on details about which clients had been spoken to, which team members were ready, and who would step in if an account required immediate attention. He used phrases like, "We're evaluating" and "We're taking steps," which in investor language mean, "We don't know yet." Then the exchange that would appear in headlines later happened. An investor asked about a specific institutional account, one that had been on my list for years. Preston fumbled the answer, then attempted to deflect with corporate platitude. Someone in the back channel, likely another investor, asked whether Optima could provide named points of contact within a day. Preston promised to follow up and offered to escalate the request. That language is the verbal equivalent of fumbling with a parachute buckle. People who move money want named contacts and assurance now, not escalation. From where I sat at Apex, I watched the call as a kind of slow-motion decapitation. The audience's tone shifted. Questions hardened. Rumors that had been whispering in private pitch threads crept into public chat boxes. Traders and market watchers are remarkably efficient at translating doubt into action. At 4:37, the stock responded. It wasn't a collapse so much as a rearrangement, a sell-off that reflected a reweighing of risk. Press releases and legal letters can patch narratives, but once capital starts to reallocate, optics follow. Arthur's team asked for the named contact again, with an explicit timetable. Optima's response continued to be vague. That day, a few clients whose allocations were sizable enough to change a book quietly asked for more direct engagement. The market monitors took note. By late afternoon, the board was in emergency session. I received a text from Chloe. People are panicking. My chest tightened. The old, familiar mix of triumph and guilt. There is rarely a clean victory in these things. Victories are messy, with bruises on both sides. I told her to breathe, document, and forward anything that looked like pressure from legal teams. Legal letters arrived like weather reports, insistent in tone, but often performative in immediate effect. Gerald's team sent a letter that read like a possessed thesaurus. We reserve rights, we will act, etc. Marcus's counsel replied that they would respond professionally and, if necessary, litigate jurisdictional claims. The lawyers were moving pieces. and that movement was intended to stabilize a narrative, but the narrative had already been compromised. The evening carried with it the sense that something had shifted irreversibly. Arthur's decision hung in the air like a scent. Paul, an investor contact who'd been friendly for years, sent a message: "I'm watching. If sterling moves, quiet money follows." I felt the world tilt toward an outcome I nudged, not forced. 2 nights later, when the board finally issued a statement that named temporary contacts and promised a review, it read like damage control in a hurricane. The statement tried to keep clients calm while preserving leadership. It did not work. Reassurance is a currency that must travel faster than panic. Optima's response arrived a second too late. On the morning that Arthur moved, the world behaved as if someone had synchronized their clocks. At 9 o'clock, his assistant sent a terse note: "Mr. Sterling has authorized the reallocation. Transfers will begin at 12. Transfers are mechanical, quiet, and decisive. They don't make noise in the streets. They rearrange portfolios and shift boardroom leverage. At 12 o'clock, the funds began to move. Financial movement is less the dramatic pulling of a lever than the slow rerouting of water. It finds channels and then widens them. After Sterling's transfer, other investors whose allocations were influenced by his decision contacted their managers. Some moved cash, some asked for named contacts and public confirmation. It was not uniform, but it was enough. Within 48 hours, Optima had seen substantial reallocation. The public fallout was not just financial, it was reputational. News outlets began to ask straightforward questions. How could a firm with apparent governance inconsistencies have such a sudden leadership decision? Preston, who'd been installed as an heir to influence, became the image of shaky stewardship. He appeared on air the day after the transfers with a statement about strategic realignment. The clip made him look like a man trying to look at a map upside down. I watched all of this with a muted satisfaction that was heavier than joy. I had not set out to humiliate a person. I had wanted to protect my clients and my professional integrity. Yet humiliation came as a byproduct. In those quiet moments, I found myself apologizing in my head to the people who'd been inconvenienced by the upheaval. Junior staff waking to chaotic inboxes, an analyst like Chloe who'd been thrown into triage, the receptionist who had to answer calls about the crisis. The moral weight of consequences is a thing that sits in your bones. It keeps you awake at strange hours. You sleep with the taste of decisions on your teeth. I do not pretend it's pretty, it's necessary. After the transfers began, Optima's board attempted to respond with a staged governance overhaul, new external advisors, a committee review, promises of external audits. These are good PR moves if you have weeks to convince people. They are insufficient when money has already left, because capital votes louder than statements. In the days that followed, a cascade of smaller consequences arrived. Preston's public communications became increasingly defensive and at times contradictory. He attempted to assure employees and clients, and in doing so he revealed gaps in the firm's knowledge and preparedness. Media outlets, always hungry for a narrative with a face, contrasted Preston's smirking press quotes with the steady, unsensational professionalism of people who'd worked with me for years. The optics were brutal. Arthur, in his quiet way, never grandstanded. He had moved capital not to humiliate but to address risk. His move created a market signal. When a whale reallocates, other players listen. The board's newfound interest in governance was not a victory for them. It was an admission that they had, until recently, allowed a dynasty to outweigh due diligence. At Apex, my role shifted from negotiator to manager. There were onboarding logistics, client calls that required a soft touch, and a new team to lead. Marcus gave me the latitude I'd asked for, the named role that satisfied Arthur's continuity concern. I accepted it because the role matched the work I loved, moving people towards stability in messy moments. My first weeks at Apex were not triumphant parades. They were long calls at odd hours, detailed handoffs, and the steady building of trust. Chloe joined as a contractor for a transition period. We shielded her from the worst of the public noise and helped her document everything she'd done for future reference. Sarah Miller, who remained a quiet, nervous ally, sent a short email one afternoon. "I did the right thing." She did not ask for thanks. She had done what compliance does at its best, put truth in a place where it could be read. Litigation simmered. Optima's legal team continued to posture, and Gerald's rhetoric became pejoratively active. But posture is often a buying time technique. Litigation is costly and uncertain. Marcus's counsel was deliberate. They would defend our position, but they preferred negotiated outcomes. Litigation rarely solves reputational problems. It merely drags them into other rooms. There were other, quieter costs. A few staffers at Optima lost their jobs in the weeks that followed, as clients reallocated relationships to teams they trusted. Members of the staff who'd once relied on the firm's stability were suddenly considering resumes. I felt a tug of responsibility for those downstream effects. I called Chloe more than strictly necessary. I made introductions. I hired 2 former Optima people into contract roles at Apex because I believed competence should have a place to land. This was not a clean revenge tale. It was messy, human, and ethically complicated, which is what real life tends to be. I'd set out to reclaim what was mine, the relationships and the proof that those relationships were not chattel to be reassigned by a nepotistic hand. I had done that without deleting servers, without forging documents, without crashing anything intentionally. I had used timing, reputation, and the unavoidable ethics of money to push a correction. There came a day, months later, when the headlines had softened and the market had adjusted, when the board at Optima made additional changes. Richard stepped down from an executive committee role. Preston was asked to take a leave. These were public outcomes. Some people called them justice. Others called them the market doing what markets do, shedding what it had decided was risky. I don't celebrate the personal losses that followed. I am not that person. I understand that careers are fragile and that sometimes the cost of fairness is borne by innocence. I still think of the receptionist who had to answer calls about layoffs, and of Chloe sitting at her kitchen table with a mug in her hands, deciding whether to sleep or reply to another text. Their faces are part of the ledger of the story. In my new office at Apex, the view makes you forget things for a second. Daylight gathers into a neat and different sweep across the glass. Marcus kept his promise to let me own the client interface. I built a team that understood continuity as a craft, not an emergency measure. We instituted tighter documentation practices and, quietly, reached out to several clients whose loyalty had been tested. They did not move en masse because of a press release. They moved because someone named for them was credible, responsive, and calm. One afternoon, Arthur and I walked out onto a terrace after a meeting. He smoked a cigar with the nonchalance of someone who has never been defined by showmanship. He looked at me and said, softly, "You did what you could with what you had. That's sometimes the most moral thing you can do." I thought about the moral calculus in his sentence. I had not set out to topple people for sport. I had tried to correct a system that rewarded the wrong behaviors. The tools I used, timing, reputation, law, and leverage, were not pretty, but they were lawful and, to my mind, proportional. The final public beat came much later, after the market had digested the moves and the board had settled into new faces. There was an op-ed that described the episode as a lesson in governance and a trade newsletter that used my name as shorthand for relationship capital. I do not like my name in the papers. I like results. There is a small private satisfaction that comes when a CEO who once called you difficult to manage finds that the people who do the real work have choices. That satisfaction is not vengeful glee. It is a tight, clear acknowledgement that competence matters. It is confirmation that you cannot appoint loyalty by fiat, and that relationships, if cultivated honestly, are not company property. I still check in with Chloe. She is rebuilding, professionally and emotionally. She jokes now that Buster gives the best career advice because he will sit with anyone for treats. Sarah Miller moved on to a role where compliance enjoys the respect it deserves. Marcus, pragmatic as ever, earned the gratitude of clients who found steadiness in tumult. Arthur continues to move quietly and decisively. As for Preston and Richard, their narrative is not mine to narrate. They fared as people who mistake position for capability often do. Some recalibrate, some leave, and some get the chance to learn humility in the public forum of their peers. I will say this: when the person who thought they could define you by a single line of shorthand is the one who has to explain their own stewardship on camera, reality nets a different kind of truth. The moral of the story, the part people always ask me to distill, is not a how-to. It never is. It is a what-ifs and a what-wases. If you ask me what I learned, I will say, value your relationships, document your work, be precise in what you say you can deliver, and understand that power is often a function of perceived continuity, not just title. I never wanted to be a villain in someone else's failed narrative.
I wanted to be a steward of the work I'd done. Sometimes stewardship requires boldness. Sometimes it requires restraint. My approach was the latter when possible, and the former when necessary. I refused to be reduced to a line item in a nepotistic ledger. I converted the trust I had cultivated into leverage that protected clients, and in the process made visible the discrepancy between appearance and competence. There's a small human moment I come back to, the night I texted Chloe to document everything, and she replied with a selfie of her and Buster, both looking exhausted but resolute. She wrote, "We'll be okay." That was all I needed to know. In the weeks that followed the peak of the crisis, I settled into a rhythm that felt less like triumph and more like stewardship. I hired carefully, mentored fiercely, and kept my dog on my lap through long calls. I watched as Optima patched their governance, as clients who had once been uncertain found new homes, and as the market allocated capital in ways that, if imperfect, were at least more honest than the prior status quo. Revenge stories like to end with a flourish, a fall from grace, a dramatic public shaming, a soundtrack. Real life is less tidy. It gives you a ledger of consequences and asks you to live inside them. I accepted the consequences because I could not accept the alternative, letting incompetence calcify into accepted reality. If you're still with me, here's what I would leave you with. Competence is durable. Reputation is fragile but real. When someone tries to turn people into assets they can reassign at will, the people who actually hold the relationships will sooner or later remind the market who delivers value. You don't take revenge by breaking things, you take it by making the truth plain. If you want more true corporate revenge stories, subscribe and check the playlist.